The year was 1978. Blackridge was a small, quiet town, but in recent months, it had been plagued by a string of mysterious disappearances. People were vanishing without a trace, leaving the entire town gripped by fear. Residents avoided the dark, locking themselves indoors after sunset. Richard Blake and his son, Ethan, worked as coroners in the local morgue. For them, it was business as usual, even as the town grew more unsettled. But one night, Sheriff Matt brought in the body of a young woman discovered in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. "This one is different," the sheriff muttered, his face pale. "I swear, when we found her, it felt like she was still alive. Something's wrong with that place." Without further explanation, he hurried out, leaving the Blakes alone with the body. The young woman's body was pristine, almost unnaturally untouched by time or decay. Her hands, however, were clenched tightly, as though she had been grasping for something before she died. Ethan noticed strange symbols carved into her wrists. When Richard examined them, he recalled seeing similar marks in an old text about ancient curses. "These symbols represent a binding spell," he said, trying to downplay the unease creeping into his voice. When they opened the woman's stomach during the autopsy, they found a small, scorched piece of parchment with Latin text that read, "The one who breaks the seal shall merge with the darkness." Before they could decipher its meaning, the morgue lights flickered. Ethan turned to check the circuit box, only to feel a sudden chill. When he returned, he swore the corpse's fingers had moved slightly. Ethan told his father about the movement, but Richard dismissed it as nerves or an optical illusion. "You're tired," he said. "It's just your imagination." But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences intensified. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and faint whispers seemed to echo through the halls. When Richard opened the woman's chest cavity, a black liquid sprayed out, evaporating the moment it touched the air. Ethan, now visibly shaken, decided to check the security cameras. What he saw chilled him to the bone. The corpse, lying on the table just moments ago, was now sitting upright. Its head turned slightly, as though looking directly at the camera. When he rushed back to the autopsy room to warn his father, they found the corpse still lying down. But as they began to cover it with a sheet, her eyes snapped open. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Desperate, Richard called his old friend Samuel, an expert in the occult. Samuel arrived and immediately recognized the symbols carved into the woman's wrists. His face went pale. "This seal is ancient," he said. "It's meant to bind a spirit, a powerful one. If this seal has been broken, then the spirit is loose. But destroying the body won't help. It will only make things worse." Samuel explained that the spirit was likely tied to a legend about a witch who had been burned alive in the area 200 years ago. Before her death, she had cursed the townsfolk, vowing to return. "This body is our anchor," he said, "and if we don't rebind her, the curse will consume us." Samuel prepared a ritual to bind the spirit back into the corpse. He instructed Richard and Ethan to draw protective symbols around the body. As they began, the air in the morgue grew heavy. Shadows danced along the walls, and the whispers returned, louder than before. The corpse began to twitch violently, and a guttural growl filled the room. Samuel tried to chant the binding incantation, but the shadows in the room grew larger, eventually enveloping him. He screamed as a black substance poured from his mouth, and his lifeless body collapsed to the floor. Ethan grabbed his father. "We need to finish this," he shouted. With trembling hands, Richard took a ceremonial dagger Samuel had brought and plunged it into the corpse's heart. The body erupted into flames, disintegrating into ash. The room fell silent, and the oppressive darkness lifted. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare was over. As Richard and Ethan prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something in the mirror. The woman's reflection. She stood there, smiling eerily, though her body was gone. Hum of the cooler in the background seemed louder now, almost like a growl. Then it happened. The lights flickered, once, twice, then total darkness. "Damn it," Richard muttered, fumbling for a flashlight. Ethan stood frozen, his breathing shallow. In the pitch-black room, he thought he heard something, a soft rustling, like fabric being dragged across the floor. "Dad." Ethan whispered. "I'm here," Richard said, his voice calm but strained. The flashlight clicked on, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Richard swept the light around the room, pausing briefly on the corpse. It was still there, lying motionless on the steel table, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. "Look at her hands," Ethan said suddenly. Richard aimed the flashlight at the woman's hands. Her fingers, which had been tightly curled moments ago, were now slightly open. "That's impossible," Richard said, his voice firm but unconvincing. "It's just rigor mortis releasing." "Rigor mortis doesn't move like that," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. Before Richard could respond, a loud metallic clang echoed through the morgue. Both men jumped, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the room. Ethan grabbed a scalpel from the nearby tray, his hand trembling. "It came from the cooler," Richard said, pointing toward the row of cold storage drawers, where unclaimed bodies were kept. As they approached the drawers, another sound echoed, a deep, resonant thud, like someone pounding on metal. Ethan tightened his grip on the scalpel. Richard reached for the handle of the middle drawer. "Stay back," he said. He yanked it open, and the drawer slid out with a loud screech. It was empty. Before they could process this, the thudding started again, this time, louder and closer. It wasn't coming from the drawers. It was coming from the autopsy table. Richard swung the flashlight back toward the woman's body. Her head had turned slightly, facing them. Her lifeless eyes were wide open. "Dad, she's..." Before Ethan could finish, the room was plunged into darkness once more. The flashlight flickered weakly, its beam sputtering like a dying flame. Richard muttered curses under his breath, smacking the flashlight in frustration. Then came the whispering. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices speaking in a language Ethan couldn't understand. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling them like predators. "Turn it back on," Ethan yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm trying," Richard barked. When the light finally steadied, the woman's body was gone. Ethan gasped, his eyes darting around the room. "Where is she?" Richard swung the flashlight frantically, its beam illuminating every corner of the room. Then they saw her. She was standing in the corner, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her lips were moving, forming silent words, but it wasn't just her. The shadows around her seemed to writhe and twist, taking on shapes human-like figures with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly dropping the scalpel. "What the hell is that?" The woman's head snapped upright, her lifeless eyes locking onto them. She took a step forward, her bare feet slapping against the cold tile floor. Richard grabbed Ethan's arm. "Run," he shouted. The flashlight flickered again, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping the room in darkness. The whispers turned into screams, and the last thing Ethan saw before the light went out completely was the woman's hand reaching toward him. The woman's reflection. She stood there, smiling eerily, though her body was gone. Her voice echoed through the morgue. "You think this ends with me? The curse never dies." The next morning, the morgue seemed normal again, but Richard and Ethan knew the truth. Every night after that, faint screams could be heard from the building. And in his dreams, Ethan saw the woman's lifeless eyes staring back at him, waiting,